All right, welcome to the Week 9 Forum. This week we're looking at the role that policymakers play in the intelligence policy cycle and also at how the intelligence community contributes to implementing foreign policy. When you look at how policymakers connect with the IC, the focus needs to be on kind of the concentric rings of the processes that are constantly spinning around the people in these elected and Senate approved positions. Lowenthal describes the foreign policy establishment as five discrete components with varying degrees of power and influence. Obviously, the president sits at the center of that process and wields disproportionate influence depending on the capabilities of the person sitting in the White House. Why did Richard Nixon believe that there was a serious gulf between president's interests and the interests of the career civil servants occupying the agencies of the foreign policy establishment? That's certainly something that we can talk about. What does that reveal about Nixon, and to what extent was he just kind of broadly correct? When you look at the main agencies responsible for foreign policy, you see distinctive agencies with distinctive political cultures informing their priorities. When you look, for example, at state, what is its priority? How does its culture inform its, people's perception, foreign service officers' perception of their job? What does it want to do within the foreign policy process? What sorts of things does it want out of the intelligence agencies? What are some of the primary criticisms of state's role in the foreign policy process? The Department of Defense is kind of the 800-pound gorilla of foreign policy and intelligence. In personnel and budget, it dwarfs state, for example. What are the Department of Defense foreign policy priorities? What are the primary criticisms of defense's role in the foreign policy process? Another potential 800-pound gorilla is the Department of Homeland Security. It's huge, it's dispersed, it's a sprawling bureaucratic giant that really is kind of a combination of different agencies. And it's struggled to forge a distinctive bureaucratic culture. What are DHS's primary foreign policy priorities? What are the principal criticisms of DHS's role in the foreign policy process? The National Security Council is another kind of component of the foreign policy establishment and its growing staff, and they represent another important player. The NSC has facilitated the emergence of what we call a White House-centered foreign policy process, as successive presidents have demonstrated a determination to avoid over-reliance on any one cabinet department to implement their foreign policy vision. My tease from the weekly overview is that staff equates into capacity, right? And what are some of the threats? What are some of the potential concerns that we might have with presidents having an increased capacity to act what we call expeditiously? That has enormous consequences for the conduct of foreign policy. What are some of the good and bad things that can happen when presidents have what amount to a mini bureaucracy at his or her disposal? We mentioned in earlier forums the interagency process and how this process exists to reduce conflict and to help facilitate buy-in from all potential stakeholders. Unfortunately, conflict is sort of an inevitable feature within a process that has so many distinctive stakeholders with so many distinctive political cultures. The larger departments actually have distinctive conflicts that can erupt within their department, as witnessed when Donald Rumsfeld undercut Eric Shinseki on the number of troops needed to occupy Iraq in 2003. Outside of the interagency process, what else has been done to try and reduce or manage bureaucratic conflict? Another important issue to address is the role that the intelligence community plays within a presidential administration, particularly this administration with its rocky start with the intelligence community. As President-elect Donald Trump accused the IC of taping him and alleged that they were part of a deep state hostile to his administration. At one point, he has called members of the intelligence community Nazis, or equated them with Nazis. How is this likely to impact the agencies within the intelligence community? Are some more likely to take that sort of attack personally than others? What do you think the FBI thinks of the constant criticism and threats that they've had leveled at them. Much of this chapter is a restatement of stuff that we've covered in class to date, such as the discussion of how close, the proximate versus the distance relationship, with the leaders of the IC and the president. It's always important to keep in mind. Leaders in the intelligence community need to have access to the president, but they also need to maintain objectivity. One interesting thing that arises when thinking about the relationship between the president and the IC is this idea of a decision advantage. Now, what is that? And how can the intelligence community provide that to a president? Another issue that can complicate the relationship between the IC and policymakers is the role that top appointees play. Increasingly, there appears to be a sense that, particularly in this administration, policymakers want their people to be in leadership positions within the intelligence community. How are expressly political heads of the major IC agencies viewed by the rank and file members? Currently, you have Mike Pompeo as the CIA director, and you have Dan Coats as the director of national intelligence. Both were in electoral politics. What do you think is the likelihood that the career intelligence officers believe in and respect people appointed by Donald Trump? One last issue I want to address is the general tone of the relationship between the IC and administration policymakers. Generally, policymakers want intelligence that facilitates their decision making, particularly decisions for which they're advocates. In contrast, the IC has a deeply ingrained cultural bias towards being realistic. Again, how do those contrasting perspectives color their relationship? I posted an article in addition to what you're reading from Lowenthal. It's from the most recent edition of Foreign Affairs entitled "The Unconstrained Presidency." The authors are basically arguing that the erosion of institutional restraints on presidential power predate Donald Trump and will likely persist after Donald Trump is no longer president. If anyone wants to talk about that article, there, please be my guest. So I hope I've given you plenty to think about and discuss. Remember, if anything in this chapter is confusing or contradicts what we've been learning, feel free to ask questions. That's what we're here for. So let's have a good week.